The look of pure shock on Margaret's face when I calmly said, "Actually, I own the mortgage on this house," was worth every humiliating dinner party they'd put me through. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 28 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself in a situation where my own in-laws would ban me from their family home for being beneath their standards. What they didn't know was that their precious family estate, the one they used as a weapon to remind me of my place, was only standing because of a loan I had personally guaranteed. This is the story of how I went from being the unwelcome daughter-in-law to holding all the cards, and trust me, the tables turned in ways none of us expected. Growing up in East Los Angeles as the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep us afloat, I learned early that respect isn't given freely, it's earned through hard work and determination. My mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a grocery store during the day, and took in sewing on weekends. Despite our financial struggles, she instilled in me a fierce pride in our heritage and an unwavering belief that education was the key to changing our circumstances. I was the first in my family to graduate from high school, let alone attend college. While my classmates spent their evenings hanging out at the mall or going to parties, I was studying in the public library until closing time, then heading home to help my mother with her sewing projects. Every scholarship application I filled out felt like a lottery ticket, and when I received a full academic scholarship to UCLA for business administration, my mother cried tears of joy for 3 straight days. College was a culture shock that nothing could have prepared me for. Suddenly I was surrounded by students who casually mentioned their families, vacation homes in Aspen, or spring break trips to Europe, while I was working in the campus cafeteria to afford textbooks. I felt like an impostor half the time, constantly afraid someone would discover I didn't belong in their world of privilege and opportunity. My business professors quickly recognized my analytical mind and work ethic. Professor Williams, who taught corporate finance, became my mentor and encouraged me to pursue an internship at a prestigious investment firm downtown. When I expressed doubts about fitting in at such an elite company, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Elena, intelligence and determination don't have a zip code. You've already proven you can compete with anyone." The internship at Hartwell & Associates was my first real glimpse into the world of high finance and old money. The offices occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, with marble lobbies and original artwork that probably cost more than my mother made in a year. Most of my fellow interns came from Ivy League schools and had family connections that opened doors I couldn't even see, but I had something many of them lacked: hunger. While they treated the internship as a summer adventure before their guaranteed positions at Daddy's firm, I approached every project with the intensity of someone who knew this might be my only shot. I stayed late analyzing market trends, volunteered for the assignments no one else wanted, and slowly began to prove that my background was an asset, not a liability. My attention to detail and ability to spot discrepancies in financial statements earned me recognition from the senior partners. By the end of the summer, they offered me a full-time position upon graduation, something almost unheard of for someone from my background. The salary they quoted was more than my mother had ever made in her life, and I called her crying from the parking garage, unable to believe that our sacrifice had actually paid off. Senior year flew by in a blur of advanced courses, job preparation, and the bittersweet knowledge that I was about to enter a world my mother could never fully understand. Graduation day was one of the proudest moments of my life. Watching my mother in the audience wearing the dress she had saved for months to buy, her face glowing with pride as I walked across that stage. Starting at Hartwell & Associates was intimidating, but I threw myself into the work with characteristic determination. My specialty became distressed asset analysis, helping wealthy clients navigate financial difficulties and restructure their investments. I had a particular talent for seeing opportunities others missed, probably because I understood what it meant to make every dollar count. It was during my 3rd year at the firm that I met James Whitmore at a client networking event. He was representing his family's real estate development company, and we were introduced by a mutual client who thought we might have business synergies to explore. James was handsome in that effortless way that comes with generations of good breeding, tall and athletic, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to worry about money. Our initial conversation was purely professional, discussing potential investment opportunities and market trends, but there was an undeniable chemistry between us, and by the end of the evening he had asked me to dinner to continue our discussion. That dinner turned into 3 hours of conversation that ranged far beyond business, and I found myself genuinely enchanted by his intelligence and apparent interest in my perspective. James seemed fascinated by my background and accomplishments, asking thoughtful questions about my journey from East LA to the financial district. He spoke passionately about his desire to modernize his family's business practices and bring fresh perspectives to their traditional approach. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like someone from his world was seeing me as an equal, not just the scholarship kid who got lucky. Our relationship developed slowly over months of professional collaboration and personal dinners. James was involved in expanding his family's real estate portfolio, and my expertise in financial analysis proved invaluable in evaluating potential acquisitions. Working together felt natural, and I began to see a future where my outsider perspective could actually be an advantage in his traditional family business. The Whitmore family had been in real estate development for 4 generations, building their fortune through strategic land acquisitions and luxury residential projects throughout Southern California. Their company, Whitmore Properties, was known for high-end developments that catered to the elite, and their reputation was built on exclusivity and old-world elegance. When James first mentioned introducing me to his family, I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. My experience with wealthy clients had taught me to navigate their world professionally, but becoming personally involved was entirely different territory. James assured me his parents would love me, emphasizing my intelligence and success as qualities they would surely admire. The Whitmore family estate was located in San Marino, one of the most exclusive enclaves in the greater Los Angeles area. Driving through the gates for the first time, I was struck by the understated elegance of the property. The house itself was a stunning example of Mediterranean revival architecture, with sprawling gardens and mature oak trees that had probably been planted before my grandparents were born. Margaret Whitmore greeted us at the front door, and I could immediately sense her taking my measure. She was impeccably dressed in what I recognized as designer clothing, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her smile polite but reserved. Richard Whitmore emerged from what appeared to be a study, extending a firm handshake and making appropriate small talk about my work in finance. That first dinner was a carefully choreographed affair, with conversation topics that felt like a subtle interrogation disguised as polite interest. They asked about my family background, my education, and my career aspirations, with
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The kind of precision that suggested they were checking boxes on some invisible scorecard. I answered honestly but strategically, emphasizing my professional achievements while downplaying the more challenging aspects of my upbringing. The dining room itself was a work of art, with a mahogany table that could seat 12, crystal chandeliers that caught the light from tall windows, and oil paintings of previous generations of Whitmores watching over the proceedings. Everything about the setting was designed to remind visitors of the family's long history and established position in society. As the evening progressed, I began to notice subtle signs that my background was being evaluated and found wanting. Margaret's questions about my neighborhood growing up, my mother's profession, and my family's social connections felt increasingly pointed. When I mentioned that my mother worked multiple jobs to support us, the silence that followed was brief but telling. James seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, enthusiastically sharing stories about my professional successes and the innovative approaches I had brought to various projects. His pride in my accomplishments was genuine and touching, but I could see his parents exchanging glances that suggested they were not as impressed as he hoped they would be. The evening concluded with polite pleasantries and expressions of hope that we would see each other again soon, but I left feeling like I had failed some unspoken test. James was effusive in his praise of how well the evening had gone, but my instincts told me his parents had serious reservations about our relationship. Over the following months, as James and I grew closer and our relationship became more serious, the dinner invitations to the family home became less frequent. When we did attend family gatherings, I noticed a pattern of subtle exclusions and pointed remarks that were designed to remind me of my outsider status, without being overtly rude. Margaret had a particular talent for backhanded compliments that left me questioning whether I had been insulted or praised. Comments like, "How refreshing to meet someone so ambitious despite their circumstances," or "You've certainly made the most of your opportunities," carried implications that my success was somehow remarkable given my humble origins. The family's social circle was equally challenging to navigate. At charity events and dinner parties, I was often introduced as James's friend from the financial sector, rather than his girlfriend, despite our relationship being an open secret. Conversations would shift when I joined groups, and I frequently found myself listening to discussions about private schools, country clubs, and social events that might as well have been conducted in a foreign language. James's sister, Catherine, was particularly skilled at making me feel unwelcome without ever saying anything directly offensive. She would pepper conversations with references to shared childhood experiences, family traditions, and social connections that effectively reminded everyone that I was not part of their inner circle. Her comments about new money versus established families were clearly directed at me, even when she avoided making eye contact. The breaking point came during a discussion about our engagement, which James had been hinting at for several months. When he finally broached the subject with his parents, requesting their blessing for our marriage, the response was swift and devastating. They suggested he take time to consider whether he was making a decision based on genuine compatibility or merely infatuation with someone so different from their family's usual social circle. Margaret was more direct in her objections, expressing concerns about whether I would fit into their established social network and questioning whether our different backgrounds would create long-term problems. She worried about what their friends and business associates would think, and whether bringing me into the family would somehow diminish their social standing. Richard approached the issue from a business perspective, questioning whether my presence in the family would affect their relationships with long-standing clients and partners who valued tradition and exclusivity. He suggested that while my professional skills were admirable, they might not translate well to the social responsibilities that came with being a Whitmore wife. James was devastated by his parents' reaction, having genuinely believed they would come to appreciate my qualities as he had. Our conversations about their concerns became increasingly strained, as he tried to balance loyalty to his family with his feelings for me. I could see the conflict tearing him apart, and I began to question whether love alone would be enough to overcome such fundamental disapproval. The tension reached a crescendo during a family dinner where Richard made a comment about hoping James would eventually find someone more suitable to carry on the family name. The remark was made as if I wasn't sitting right there at their table, and the casual cruelty of it took my breath away. James immediately objected, but the damage was done, and I knew I could never feel welcome in their home again. That night, driving back to my apartment in uncomfortable silence, I made a decision that would change everything. If the Whitmore family wanted to judge me based on my background rather than my character and achievements, they were about to learn exactly what those achievements could accomplish. I had been playing defense in their game of social warfare, but it was time to go on the offense. My position at Hartwell & Associates had given me access to financial information about many prominent families and businesses in the area, and I knew more about the Whitmore family's financial situation than they probably realized. The real estate market had been challenging in recent years, and many established families were quietly struggling to maintain their lifestyle and properties while preserving their public image. A few discreet inquiries confirmed what I had suspected. The Whitmore family estate, despite its impressive appearance, was heavily mortgaged, and the family business was carrying significant debt from several ambitious projects that had not performed as expected. They were asset-rich but cash-poor, a common situation among old money families who were reluctant to liquidate properties that had been in the family for generations. More importantly, I discovered that their primary mortgage holder was a financial institution that had recently been acquired by one of Hartwell & Associates' major clients. Through a complex series of transactions that I helped structure, that debt had ultimately been consolidated and securitized into a portfolio that I had personally analyzed and recommended for purchase by our firm's investment fund. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The family that considered me beneath their standards was literally indebted to an investment vehicle that I had helped create and manage. Their beautiful estate, the symbol of their superiority and generational wealth, was only standing because of financial instruments that bore my signature and recommendation. Armed with this knowledge, I began to formulate a plan that would shift the power dynamic in our relationship permanently. If the Whitmores wanted to play games of social hierarchy and exclusion, they were about to discover that in the modern world, financial leverage often trumps social pedigree. The plan required patience and careful timing, but I had learned both qualities during my years of clawing my way up from poverty to professional success. Every slight, every condescending comment, every moment of being made to feel less than worthy was fuel for the fire that would eventually consume their arrogance and transform our relationship forever. James remained blissfully unaware of both his family's financial vulnerabilities and my growing knowledge of their situation. He continued trying to bridge the gap between his family's expectations and his own desires, hoping that time and persistence would eventually win them over. I let him continue his efforts, while quietly laying the groundwork for a confrontation that would make their previous dismissals seem like gentle suggestions. The opportunity I had been waiting for presented itself during a tense family meeting where Margaret and Richard finally decided to address the elephant in the room directly. They requested that James bring me to dinner so they could have what they called an honest conversation about expectations and family standards. I agreed to attend, knowing it would likely be my last invitation to their home under the current circumstances. What they didn't know was that it would also be the evening when they discovered that their unwelcome guest held the key to their financial future, and that their attitude toward me would need to change dramatically if they wanted to keep their precious family legacy intact. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal just how much the world had changed since their generation assumed that social standing and family names were sufficient to guarantee respect and deference. They were about to learn that in the modern economy, intelligence, hard work, and financial acumen could trump generational wealth, especially when that wealth was built on borrowed money and outdated assumptions about power and privilege. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late October, and I spent the week preparing both mentally and strategically for what I knew would be a defining moment in my relationship with the Whitmore family. I chose my outfit carefully, selecting a sophisticated black dress that was expensive enough to meet their standards but understated enough to avoid appearing as though I was trying too hard to impress them. James picked me up from my apartment, and I could sense his nervousness during the drive to San Marino. He had been increasingly withdrawn over the past few days, clearly dreading the conversation his parents had requested. I suspected they had already made their decision about me and were simply going through the motions of giving our relationship a formal burial. The familiar gates of the Whitmore estate loomed ahead as we pulled into the circular driveway. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, and the house looked particularly imposing against the darkening sky. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I was no longer the intimidated young woman who had first walked through these doors months ago. I had information they didn't know I possessed, and tonight would determine how I chose to use it. Margaret greeted us at the door with her usual reserved smile, but there was something different in her demeanor. She seemed more formal than usual, as though she were preparing for a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Richard emerged from his study looking equally serious, and both parents exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they had rehearsed whatever conversation was about to unfold. The dining room had been set for 4, but the atmosphere felt more like a tribunal than a family gathering. The conversation during cocktails was stilted and superficial, covering safe topics like the weather and current events, while carefully avoiding anything personal or substantive. I could feel the tension building as we moved through the preliminary pleasantries. Dinner itself was an elaborate affair featuring the family's finest china and crystal, as though Margaret wanted to emphasize the elegance and tradition that I supposedly threatened. The courses were served by their longtime housekeeper, Maria, who had always been kind to me despite her employer's obvious disapproval. Her sympathetic glances throughout the evening suggested she understood exactly what was happening. As we finished the main course, Richard cleared his throat and assumed what I recognized as his boardroom voice. He began by acknowledging that James and I had been together for over a year, and that our relationship had clearly become serious. He spoke about the importance of family compatibility and shared values, using language that sounded diplomatic but carried unmistakable implications. Margaret took over the conversation at that point, her tone gentle but firm as she expressed her concerns about our different backgrounds and social circles. She worried about whether I would be comfortable in their world of charity galas, country club events, and business entertaining. Her words were carefully chosen to sound like concern for my well-being rather than criticism of my suitability. The conversation continued with increasing directness as both parents outlined their reservations about our relationship. They questioned whether James and I truly understood the challenges we would face as a couple from such different worlds. They worried about the impact on the family business and their social standing within the community they had been part of for generations. James tried repeatedly to defend our relationship, pointing out my professional success and personal qualities, but his parents had clearly made up their minds. They weren't interested in hearing about my achievements or character, because those weren't the metrics by which they measured suitability for their family. What mattered to them was pedigree, social connections, and the kind of background that couldn't be earned through hard work or intelligence. The conversation reached its crescendo when Richard finally stated their position plainly. While they respected my accomplishments and wished me well in my career, they didn't believe I was the right match for James or their family. They suggested that James needed to consider his responsibilities to the family name and legacy, which required a partner who understood and shared their social position. Margaret added that they hoped I would understand their concerns weren't personal, but rather based on practical considerations about compatibility and social expectations. She assured me that they bore me no ill will, but believed it would be better for everyone if James and I ended our relationship before we became even more deeply involved. The dismissal was delivered with polite language and sympathetic expressions, but the message was crystal clear. I was being formally ejected from their family circle and asked to remove myself from James's life voluntarily. They expected me to accept their judgment gracefully and disappear quietly, preserving everyone's dignity while acknowledging my inferior status. James was visibly upset by his parents' ultimatum, arguing passionately that their concerns were outdated and unfair. He pointed out that the world had changed since their generation, and that judging people based on their family background rather than their individual merit was both wrong and short-sighted. His defense of me was touching but ultimately futile against their entrenched position. Throughout this entire exchange, I had remained largely silent, allowing them to reveal the full extent of their prejudice and arrogance. I sipped my wine calmly and listened as they systematically dismantled my worthiness based on criteria I could never meet, because they were determined by birth rather than achievement. Their confidence in their position was absolute, and they clearly expected me to accept their verdict without protest. When they finally finished their presentation and turned to me expectantly, I set down my wine glass and looked around the beautiful dining room that represented everything they valued about their family heritage. The oil paintings of distinguished ancestors, the inherited silver and crystal, the mahogany furniture that had been passed down through generations, all symbols of a legacy they believed made them inherently superior to someone like me. I complimented them on their lovely home and thanked them for their honesty about their feelings toward our relationship. My calm response seemed to surprise them, as they had probably expected either tears or angry protests. Instead, I acknowledged that they had every right to their opinions and preferences regarding their son's choice of partner. Then I mentioned casually that I had always been curious about the history of their beautiful estate and wondered if they might tell me more about when it was built and how long it had been in the family. The sudden change of topic caught them off guard, but Richard was happy to launch into a detailed history of the property and its significance to their family legacy. He explained how his grandfather had purchased the land in the 1920s and built the house as a symbol of the family's rising prominence in Los Angeles society. He described the careful attention to architectural detail and the extensive gardens that had been designed by a famous landscape architect of the era. The house had been the setting for important business deals, social gatherings, and family celebrations for nearly a century. Margaret added stories about entertaining prominent guests over the years, including business leaders, politicians, and celebrities who had graced their dining room and gardens. She spoke with obvious pride about the role their home had played in cementing their family's social position and providing a foundation for their continued influence in the community. I listened with apparent fascination, asking occasional questions about specific features or historical details. My genuine interest in their family history seemed to soften their attitude slightly, as though my appreciation for their heritage might indicate some redeeming qualities despite my unsuitable background. They were clearly pleased to have an audience for stories they had probably told countless times. As Richard concluded his narrative about the house's significance to their family identity, I nodded thoughtfully and made a comment about how wonderful it must be to have such deep roots and stability. I mentioned that coming from a background where financial security was never guaranteed, I had developed a deep appreciation for the kind of generational wealth that allowed families to maintain properties like theirs. The comment seemed to resonate with them, and Margaret actually smiled as she agreed that financial stability was indeed something to be grateful for. She spoke about how fortunate they felt to have inherited not just property but also the business acumen and social connections that had allowed them to maintain their lifestyle across multiple generations. I agreed that maintaining such a property must require significant resources and careful financial management. I expressed admiration for families who could balance the costs of upkeep with the desire to preserve their heritage for future generations. My comments were innocuous enough, but I could see James beginning to look puzzled by my sudden interest in his family's financial situation. Richard, warming to the topic, began discussing some of the challenges facing families like theirs in the current economic climate. He mentioned that maintaining historic properties was becoming increasingly expensive, and that many old families were struggling to balance preservation with practical financial considerations. His openness about these challenges suggested he viewed me as sufficiently harmless to share such information. I sympathized with these difficulties and mentioned that through my work in finance, I had seen many established families facing similar challenges. I spoke about how complex the modern financial landscape had become, and how even families with substantial assets sometimes found themselves vulnerable to market fluctuations and changing economic conditions. The conversation was proceeding exactly as I had hoped, with both parents becoming increasingly comfortable discussing their financial situation with someone they viewed as professionally knowledgeable but personally irrelevant. They had no idea they were providing me with the perfect opening to reveal information that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between us. Margaret mentioned that they had recently had to make some difficult decisions about restructuring their financial obligations to maintain the property and the family business. She spoke about these challenges as temporary setbacks that would be resolved once certain market conditions improved, but her comments confirmed what I already knew about their leveraged position. I expressed understanding about the complexities of asset management, particularly when dealing with properties that had both sentimental and financial value. I mentioned that many of my clients faced similar challenges when trying to balance liquidity needs with long-term asset preservation. My professional insights seemed to further legitimize my presence in their conversation, even as they maintained their position about my unsuitability for their family. James remained largely silent during this financial discussion, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. He seemed particularly puzzled by my apparent acceptance of his parents' rejection and my willingness to engage in small talk about their family property. I could see him struggling to understand why I wasn't fighting harder for our relationship or showing more emotion about their ultimatum. The conversation continued with increasing technical detail as Richard described some of the specific financial instruments they had used to manage their cash flow challenges. He spoke about mortgage refinancing, asset-backed securities, and other financial products with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was discussing these matters with a sympathetic but ultimately powerless audience. I listened attentively and asked informed questions that demonstrated my professional expertise, while gradually steering the conversation toward more specific details about their current financial structure. My questions were framed as professional curiosity rather than personal interest, which allowed them to continue sharing information they probably should have kept private. As the evening progressed, I began to piece together a complete picture of their financial situation, based on their casual revelations and my existing knowledge from my professional research. The scope of their leverage was even more extensive than I had initially realized, and their vulnerability was greater than they seemed to understand. Margaret eventually began to look tired, and Richard suggested they move to the library for coffee and brandy. The change of venue seemed to signal that the formal part of the evening was concluding, and I sensed that they expected me to gracefully accept their dismissal and make my exit. Instead, I accepted their invitation to continue the conversation in more comfortable surroundings. The library was Richard's pride and joy, filled with leather-bound volumes, antique furniture, and family photographs spanning several generations. The room embodied everything the Whitmores valued about their heritage and social position. As we settled into comfortable chairs with our drinks, the atmosphere became more relaxed, and they seemed to consider the evening's unpleasant business successfully concluded. I complimented them on their beautiful library and mentioned how impressed I was with their collection of first editions and rare volumes. My appreciation for their literary treasures seemed to further soften their attitude, and Margaret actually began showing me some of their most prized books and explaining their provenance. As we examined a particularly valuable first edition, I made a casual comment about how important it was to properly insure such valuable collections, especially when they were being used as collateral for financial instruments. The comment was delivered so casually that its implications didn't immediately register, but I saw Richard's expression change slightly as he processed what I had said. I continued discussing the intersection of art, literature, and finance, mentioning some of the innovative ways my clients had found to leverage their collections while maintaining possession of items with sentimental value. My comments were professionally informed and seemingly innocent, but they carried subtle implications about my knowledge of their specific situation. Margaret asked how I knew so much about art and collectible financing, and I explained that many of my clients at Hartwell & Associates were collectors who needed creative solutions for managing their assets. I mentioned that our firm had developed particular expertise in helping established families navigate complex financial structures while preserving their most treasured possessions. The conversation was becoming increasingly specific, and I could see both parents beginning to realize that my professional knowledge might be more relevant to their situation than they had initially understood. James was looking increasingly confused by the technical nature of our discussion and the apparent familiarity I displayed with financial instruments they were using. I decided it was time to begin revealing the true purpose of my presence at their dinner table. I mentioned casually that I had recently been involved in analyzing a particularly complex portfolio of real estate debt that included several historic properties in the San Marino area. My comment was delivered as part of our ongoing conversation about asset management, but I could see Richard's posture stiffen slightly. I continued by explaining how interesting it was to work on deals involving properties with such rich histories and established families. I spoke about the challenges of balancing financial practicalities with preservation of family legacies, using language that seemed general but carried increasingly specific implications about their situation. Margaret asked if I could share any details about these local properties, and I explained that client confidentiality prevented me from being too specific. However, I mentioned that the portfolio included several properties that were built in the 1920s by prominent local families, and that the financial structures involved were quite sophisticated and interesting from a professional perspective. The atmosphere in the room was beginning to change as both parents started to realize that our conversation might not be as coincidental as they had initially believed. James was looking back and forth between us with growing confusion, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand but unable to identify the source of the tension. I decided to become slightly more direct in my revelations, mentioning that one of the properties in the portfolio was particularly impressive, featuring Mediterranean Revival architecture and extensive gardens designed by a famous landscape architect from the 1920s. My description was general enough to maintain plausible deniability but specific enough to make my knowledge unmistakable. Richard set down his brandy glass with more force than necessary and asked directly whether I was referring to any property they might be familiar with. His tone had shifted from casual conversation to something approaching interrogation, and I could see Margaret looking increasingly alarmed as she began to understand the implications of our discussion. I maintained my professional demeanor and explained that I couldn't discuss specific client information, but that I found it fascinating when my work intersected with such distinguished local families. I mentioned that the financial instruments involved in the portfolio were quite sophisticated, involving multiple layers of debt consolidation and securitization that required careful analysis to understand fully. The pretense of casual conversation was beginning to crumble as the reality of the situation became clearer to both parents. James was still struggling to understand what was happening, but he could clearly sense that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically from the beginning of the evening. Margaret asked directly whether I was suggesting that I had professional knowledge of their family's financial affairs. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the beginning of panic underneath her polite inquiry. She was starting to realize that the woman they had just dismissed as unsuitable might actually hold significant power over their financial future. I confirmed that through my work at Hartwell & Associates, I had indeed been involved in analyzing financial instruments that might be relevant to their situation. I explained that as part of my professional responsibilities, I had reviewed and recommended the acquisition of certain debt portfolios that included properties similar to theirs. The full implications of my revelation were beginning to sink in, and I could see both parents exchanging glances that conveyed growing alarm. They were starting to understand that the woman they had spent the evening condescending to and dismissing might actually be in a position to significantly impact their financial stability. Richard demanded to know exactly what I was implying about their financial situation, and I calmly explained that I wasn't implying anything. I was simply sharing information about my professional involvement in financial instruments that happened to be relevant to their property and business interests. I mentioned that the debt portfolio I had analyzed included mortgages and business loans that had been consolidated and securitized by various financial institutions before being acquired by our investment fund. The complex nature of these transactions meant that the ultimate ownership of debt obligations was often several steps removed from the original lenders. Margaret's face had gone pale as she began to understand that their financial obligations might ultimately be controlled by the very firm where I worked, and potentially by investment recommendations I had personally made. The irony of the situation was not lost on any of us, and the power dynamic that had seemed so clear at the beginning of the evening was rapidly shifting. James finally found his voice and demanded to know what we were really talking about. The confusion and concern in his voice reflected his growing realization that something significant was happening that he didn't understand. I could see him looking back and forth between his parents and me, trying to piece together the implications of our increasingly tense conversation. I decided it was time to make my position absolutely clear. I looked directly at Richard and Margaret and spoke in the calm, professional tone I used when delivering analysis to clients. I explained that through a series of acquisitions and consolidations, the mortgage on their property and several business loans related to their real estate development company had been purchased by an investment fund managed by Hartwell & Associates. Furthermore, I continued, I had been the primary analyst responsible for evaluating and recommending the acquisition of that particular debt portfolio. My analysis had concluded that the underlying assets were valuable, and the borrowers were likely to continue meeting their obligations, making it an attractive investment for our fund. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. Both parents stared at me with expressions of shock and disbelief, as though they couldn't quite process what I had just told them. James looked confused and concerned, clearly struggling to understand the implications of what he had just heard. I continued in my calm, professional voice, explaining that this meant their monthly mortgage payments and business loan obligations were ultimately being made to an investment fund that I helped manage. While they dealt with loan servicers and never interacted directly with the ultimate debt holders, their financial obligations were now part of a portfolio that fell within my professional responsibilities. Richard finally found his voice and asked whether I was threatening them in some way. I assured him that I was simply providing information about the financial relationships that existed between us, relationships that predated my involvement with their family and had nothing to do with my personal relationship with James. I explained that I had become aware of these connections through routine professional research and had initially chosen not to mention them because they seemed irrelevant to our personal relationship. However, given the conversation we had just concluded about my suitability for their family, I thought it might be appropriate to provide complete transparency about all aspects of our relationship. Margaret asked what this meant for their financial situation, and I assured her that nothing had changed from a practical perspective. Their loan terms remained the same, their payment obligations were unchanged, and their relationship with their loan servicers continued as before. The only difference was that they now knew who ultimately held their debt. However, I continued, as someone with significant influence over the management of their debt portfolio, I thought they should be aware that their financial obligations were being evaluated on an ongoing basis. Our fund regularly reviewed the performance and risk profile of all investments, and decisions about loan modifications, accelerations, or other actions were made based on our assessment of each borrower's situation. James demanded to know what I was really saying, and I explained that I was simply ensuring his parents had complete information about our financial relationship. As a professional courtesy, I thought they should know that the woman they had just declared unsuitable for their family actually held significant influence over their financial future. The revelation had completely transformed the atmosphere in the room. The confident dismissal they had delivered earlier in the evening now seemed remarkably short-sighted, and I could see them struggling to reassess the balance of power between us. The woman they had condescended to as socially inferior was revealing herself to be financially superior in ways they had never imagined. I assured them that my personal feelings about their treatment of me would never influence my professional responsibilities, and that their debt would continue to be managed according to standard business practices regardless of our family relationship. However, I thought it was important for them to understand the complete picture of our interconnected situation. Richard asked whether I had deliberately sought out information about their finances, and I explained that the connection had been discovered through routine professional research. I emphasized that their debt had been acquired through normal business channels long before I became involved with their family, and that any knowledge I possessed had been obtained through legitimate professional activities. However, I continued, now that these relationships were in the open, perhaps we could have a more honest conversation about respect, suitability, and family standards. After all, the woman they had just dismissed as beneath their standards was literally in a position to determine the future of their most prized possession. The evening that had begun with my dismissal from their family circle was ending with a complete reversal of the power dynamic they had assumed would govern our relationship. Their beautiful estate, the symbol of their superiority and generational wealth, was revealed to be dependent on the goodwill of the very person they had deemed unworthy of their respect. As I prepared to deliver my final thoughts on their assessment of my suitability for their family, I could see that everything they had believed about power, status, and social hierarchy was about to be fundamentally challenged by the realities of modern finance and the changing nature of influence in contemporary society. I stood up slowly from my chair in their elegant library, setting down my brandy glass with deliberate care. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as Margaret and Richard Whitmore sat frozen, their faces pale with the dawning realization of what I had just revealed. James remained silent, his confusion giving way to something approaching awe as he began to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. Looking directly at Margaret, I spoke with the quiet confidence that comes from holding all the cards in a game your opponents didn't even know they were playing. I reminded her of her earlier comment about family standards and questioned whether she truly believed that financial responsibility and professional achievement were somehow less valuable than inherited social position. I pointed out that while they had spent the evening questioning my worthiness based on my family background, they had failed to recognize that their own family's continued prosperity depended entirely on the kind of financial acumen and hard work they seemed to dismiss so easily. Their beautiful home, their social standing, their ability to maintain their lifestyle, all of it rested on obligations that were now under my professional oversight. Margaret attempted to maintain her composure, suggesting that business relationships were separate from personal family matters. She argued that financial arrangements had nothing to do with social compatibility or cultural fit within their established circle. Her voice carried less conviction than it had earlier in the evening, but she was clearly trying to salvage some semblance of her original position. I acknowledged her point about separating business from personal matters, then observed that they had made no such distinction when judging my suitability for their family. They had allowed my professional background to influence their personal opinion of me, so perhaps it was only fair that my professional position should inform their understanding of our relationship dynamics. Richard cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the conversation by suggesting that we were all getting ahead of ourselves. He proposed that everyone take a step back and approach the situation more rationally, without letting emotions or business complications cloud the real issues at hand. His words carried the tone of someone accustomed to managing difficult negotiations, but his underlying nervousness was unmistakable. I agreed that a rational approach was indeed appropriate and suggested we examine the facts objectively. The facts were that they had invited me to dinner specifically to inform me that I was unsuitable for their family based on my social background. They had delivered this verdict with complete confidence in their authority to make such judgments and their expectation that I would accept their decision without question. However, I continued, the facts also included my professional role in managing their financial obligations and my influence over decisions that could significantly impact their ability to maintain their current lifestyle. If we were truly approaching this rationally, perhaps they should reconsider whether their assessment of power dynamics in this relationship was entirely accurate. James finally found his voice and asked what I was actually proposing. His tone suggested he was struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the professional powerhouse, who was systematically dismantling his parents' assumptions about superiority and control. I could see him reassessing everything he thought he understood about our relationship and his family's position. I turned to James and explained that I wasn't proposing anything at all. I was simply providing complete transparency about the relationships and responsibilities that connected our families in ways none of us had previously acknowledged. I thought it was important for everyone to have accurate information before making decisions about respect, acceptance, and family suitability. I reminded them that earlier in the evening, they had expressed concerns about whether I would fit into their social world and whether my presence would somehow diminish their standing in the community. I suggested that perhaps they should consider whether their social standing might actually be enhanced by association with someone who had demonstrated such clear financial acumen and professional success. Margaret's face flushed as she demanded to know whether I was using their financial situation to manipulate their acceptance of our relationship. She accused me of leveraging business relationships inappropriately and suggested that such behavior proved I was indeed unsuitable for their family, regardless of my professional position. I remained calm as I addressed her accusation, pointing out that I had discovered their financial connection through routine professional activities long before tonight's conversation. I had chosen not to mention it initially because I believed personal relationships should stand on their own merits, separate from business considerations. However, I continued, since they had chosen to base their judgment of me on external factors rather than personal qualities, it seemed appropriate to ensure they had complete information about all the external factors involved. If family background and social position were relevant criteria for evaluation, then surely financial relationships and professional achievements should be considered as well. Richard attempted to assert control by stating that regardless of any business relationships, their concerns about social compatibility remained valid. He argued that financial arrangements were temporary and changeable, while cultural differences and social backgrounds were fundamental and permanent obstacles to family harmony. I nodded thoughtfully and agreed that some things were indeed permanent and unchangeable. My family background, for instance, would always be exactly what it was, regardless of my professional achievements or financial position. However, I observed, financial arrangements could indeed be temporary and subject to change, based on various factors including performance reviews, risk assessments, and management decisions. The implication hung in the air as both parents realized I was subtly suggesting that their financial security was less permanent than they had assumed. Their quarterly loan reviews, payment histories, and overall portfolio performance were all subject to ongoing evaluation, and any changes in management recommendations could potentially affect their terms or obligations. James stood up abruptly and demanded to know whether I was threatening his family. His voice carried a mixture of anger and disbelief as he struggled to understand how the evening had evolved from his parents dismissing me to what appeared to be some form of financial coercion. I assured James that I was absolutely not making any threats. I was simply ensuring that his family had accurate information about all aspects of our interconnected relationship. I emphasized that my professional responsibilities would always be conducted according to standard business practices, regardless of personal feelings or family dynamics. However, I continued, perhaps his parents might want to reconsider their assessment of what constituted appropriate family standards in the modern world. The woman they had deemed unworthy of their family name had achieved a level of professional success and financial influence that directly impacted their own security and stability. Margaret's composure finally cracked as she accused me of deliberately pursuing James to gain access to their family's financial information. She suggested that my entire relationship had been calculated to position myself advantageously relative to their business interests, painting me as some sort of financial predator. I responded to her accusation with genuine sadness rather than anger. I explained that her willingness to believe such a conspiracy theory revealed more about her prejudices than about my character. The fact that she could more easily believe I was a calculating manipulator than accept that a woman from my background could legitimately achieve professional success spoke volumes about her fundamental assumptions. I reminded her that I had been working at Hartwell & Associates for years before meeting James, and that my involvement in their debt portfolio had occurred through normal business channels completely independent of our personal relationship. The connection was coincidental, but not conspiratorial. Furthermore, I observed, if I had been seeking financial advantage through our relationship, I would hardly have revealed my position at a moment when they were rejecting me from their family. A truly calculating person would have used such information differently, perhaps waiting until after marriage to reveal the financial leverage I held. Richard attempted to salvage the situation by suggesting that everyone had said things in the heat of the moment that they might later regret. He proposed that we all take time to cool down and reconsider our positions more carefully, perhaps meeting again in a few days when emotions were less charged. I agreed that reflection was indeed valuable and suggested that they might want to use that time to consider what truly mattered in evaluating family relationships. Were bloodlines and social pedigree really more important than character, intelligence, and achievement? Did inherited status matter more than earned respect? I also suggested they might want to reflect on the changing nature of power and influence in contemporary society. The old social hierarchies they valued so highly were being replaced by new forms of achievement and success, and those who failed to adapt to these changes often found themselves surprised by shifting power dynamics. Standing up to leave, I thanked them for their hospitality and for their honesty about their feelings toward our relationship. I acknowledged that they had every right to their preferences and opinions, and I respected their desire to maintain their family traditions and social position. However, I continued, I hoped they would also respect my right to make my own decisions about what kind of treatment I was willing to accept and what standards I would apply in evaluating family relationships. Just as they had standards for family membership, I had standards for the respect and acceptance I required from others. James asked where this left our relationship, and I turned to him with genuine affection tempered by new understanding. I explained that I loved him deeply and had hoped to build a future together that honored both our backgrounds while creating something new and meaningful. However, I continued, I had learned tonight that his family's acceptance was conditional on my willingness to accept a subordinate position based on their assessment of my social inferiority. That was not a foundation upon which I could build a marriage or raise children who would be expected to navigate such complicated family dynamics. I suggested that James needed to decide what kind of family he wanted to be part of, and what values he wanted to guide his own future relationships. Did he share his parents' belief that social background determined personal worth, or did he believe that respect should be earned through character and achievement? Margaret made one final attempt to control the narrative by insisting that their concerns had nothing to do with social prejudice and everything to do with practical compatibility. She argued that different backgrounds inevitably led to different expectations and values that could create long-term relationship problems. I acknowledged that different backgrounds did indeed create different perspectives, and I agreed that those differences needed to be navigated carefully in any serious relationship. However, I pointed out that the differences between James and me had seemed manageable until his parents introduced their judgment that my background made me fundamentally unsuitable for their family. The real issue, I observed, was not our different backgrounds but their unwillingness to respect and value the different perspectives and experiences I brought to the relationship. They wanted James to marry someone who would seamlessly blend into their existing world without challenging or changing anything about their established patterns. I gathered my purse and coat, preparing to leave their home for what I suspected would be the last time. As I moved toward the door, I paused to deliver my final thoughts on the evening's revelations and their implications for all our futures. I explained that I had learned valuable lessons about the importance of surrounding myself with people who valued my achievements rather than dismissing them, who respected my background rather than being ashamed of it, and who understood that real family bonds were built on mutual support rather than conditional acceptance. I also noted that they had demonstrated the dangers of making assumptions about power and influence based on outdated social hierarchies. The world had changed dramatically since their generation established the rules they still tried to enforce, And those who fail to recognize these changes often found themselves disadvantaged in unexpected ways. As I reached the front door, I turned back to address them one final time. I thanked them for clarifying their position so thoroughly, and for helping me understand exactly what kind of relationship they envisioned for James and his future wife. Their honesty had been painful, but ultimately valuable in helping me make my own decisions. I wished them well in finding a daughter-in-law who would meet their exacting standards for background and social position. I hoped they would find someone who would accept their assessment of her worth based on family pedigree rather than personal achievement, and who would be content with conditional acceptance rather than genuine respect. However, I concluded, that person would not be me. I had worked too hard to overcome the limitations of my background, to accept new limitations imposed by people who valued inheritance over achievement. I deserved a family that celebrated my success rather than being embarrassed by my origins. James followed me to the door, his face a mixture of anguish and confusion. He begged me not to let his parents' prejudices destroy our relationship, arguing that we could build our own life independent of their approval or involvement. He promised to stand up to them more forcefully, and to demand they treat me with the respect I deserved. I touched his face gently and told him I loved him for his willingness to fight for our relationship. However, I explained I had realized that his parents' attitude was not just a temporary obstacle to overcome, but a fundamental reflection of values that would always create tension in our marriage. I could not build a life with someone whose family viewed me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be celebrated. Our children would grow up feeling torn between their mother's background and their grandparents' expectations, and I refused to subject another generation to the kind of conditional acceptance I had experienced tonight. The drive home was silent and thoughtful, with James clearly struggling to process everything that had happened. I felt a strange sense of peace, despite the pain of ending a relationship I had hoped would lead to marriage. The clarity about our fundamental incompatibility was actually liberating after months of trying to convince myself that love would be enough to overcome such deep-seated prejudice. Over the following weeks, James made several attempts to reconcile our relationship, promising to establish firmer boundaries with his parents and to create more distance from their social circle. He argued passionately that we could build our own traditions and values without being constrained by his family's expectations. I appreciated his efforts and his genuine desire to make our relationship work, but I had come to understand that the issues went deeper than his parents' initial prejudice. The fact that it had taken such a dramatic revelation to earn even grudging respect showed me that their fundamental attitudes about worth and value were unlikely to change significantly. Meanwhile, my professional life continued to flourish as I channeled my energy into career advancement and personal growth. The promotion I received 6 months later to senior portfolio manager came with increased responsibilities and a salary that exceeded what many of their social circle earned from their inherited investments. The irony was not lost on me that the Whitmore family's financial security continued to depend partly on investment decisions I made professionally, while they maintained their social distance from the woman whose judgment they relied on financially. Our paths occasionally crossed at business functions, where they maintained polite but distant courtesy. Richard eventually approached me at a charity gala to acknowledge that their initial assessment of my professional capabilities had been incomplete. He stopped short of apologizing for their treatment of me personally, but his recognition of my financial acumen represented a grudging admission that their social prejudices had blinded them to practical realities. Margaret never directly addressed the events of that evening, but her interactions with me at social functions became noticeably more respectful. She seemed to understand that dismissing me had been both personally hurtful and professionally short-sighted, though she never explicitly acknowledged either mistake. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was discovering my own strength and self-respect in the face of such systematic dismissal. I had learned that true confidence comes from knowing your own worth rather than seeking validation from others, and that sometimes walking away from disrespectful treatment is the most powerful response possible. James eventually married someone from their approved social circle, a lovely woman whose family background satisfied his parents' requirements for appropriate connections and cultural compatibility. I genuinely hoped they would find happiness together, though I suspected the relationship would always be constrained by the narrow expectations that had made our relationship impossible. As for me, I continued building a life based on achievement rather than inheritance, surrounded by people who valued intelligence and character over pedigree and social position. The experience had taught me invaluable lessons about standing up for myself and refusing to accept treatment that diminished my worth or potential. The financial markets continued to evolve, and my expertise in distressed asset management became increasingly valuable as economic conditions created new opportunities and challenges. My professional reputation grew beyond the confines of traditional social circles, earning recognition based on results rather than connections. Looking back on that pivotal evening in the Whitmore Library, I realized it had been a turning point not just in my relationship with James, but in my understanding of my own power and value. Sometimes the most important lessons come from discovering that you are stronger than you knew, and that you deserve more respect than others are willing to give. The woman who had walked into their home that night seeking acceptance had walked out knowing she was worthy of respect, regardless of whether others chose to give it. That transformation was worth more than any social approval or family acceptance could ever have provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.